Right. New York Times best-selling author, award-winning journalist Keith O'Brien joins the show. Let's talk about his new book on the rise and fall of Pete Rose, Charlie Hustle, the rise and fall of Pete Rose in the last glory days of baseball. Keith, you're in the Midwest now on your tour. Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Yes, I'm speaking to you today from Cincinnati, Ohio, of all places.
This is you're from Cincinnati, so you grew up on Pete Rose. But I don't know if that's why you chose Pete and why you chose now. You said that this is kind of a Shakespearean tragedy. Talk to us about why Pete and why now.
So I think in the last 35 years, as Pete has been banned from baseball and has made mistake after mistake off the field, I think we have forgotten who he really is, or who he once was, or why we ever cared in the first place. And the fact is, Pete Rose looms over baseball and still looms at times over American culture because he was an American icon. And what I wanted to do with the book was go back and tell that story, the story of this epic rise, because we only care about the fall that is also in the book because of the rise, because we ever cared about Pete in the first place. And so I wanted to look at his story through the prism of history, tell that story with unprecedented access and reporting, write it and let people come to their own conclusions. Because, I think, especially in recent years in America, Pete Rose has become like a political party. You either support him or you don't support him. But how we got here, I think, is interesting.
The book is interesting because of what you said. We've lost sight of the Pete Rose, the baseball player. There's now a whole generation of people that only know Pete Rose, the gambler. And when reading your book, you come across the fact that Pete Rose himself was a real success story. He was not this great athlete, even though he has the most hits in history. What was the most interesting thing that you came across about Pete Rose's struggle to become the baseball player that he was?
So, in my reporting, I tried to obviously further the story. And if I ever cracked open the door to a room, say, that we, the reader, we, the fan, had never been in before, that's a room I want to linger in. And in my reporting, I started interviewing men who played baseball with Pete on the west side of Cincinnati, where he was born and raised in the 1940s and 50s. So these are guys who were Pete Rose's age. They're also 81, 82, 83 years old. And, you know, in those interviews, I met many folks and got a photograph of Pete Rose's 1956 city champion baseball team. And it's a stunning photo because Pete Rose looks like he could be the little brother of the kids on the team, his teammates. He looks like he could be the bat boy on this team full of teenagers. He is so small, and why that matters is that, because of his size, he wasn't very strong. His hits didn't go very far. He was known for being scrappy. And this whole persona of Charlie Hustle begins with him long before he's ever given that nickname. He knows, even in that photograph that I have that's in the book, that he's got to play harder than the other kids in that photograph because he's simply not as talented as the kids standing around him.
Can you talk about, Pete gets to the majors and he has this success story, and then he's in the middle, as you talk about, so many formidable moments in the history of baseball during his time playing. I think you said on his legacy, no matter how you feel, you can write the history of baseball. You can't write the history of baseball without Pete Rose in the 20th century. Talk to us about how he finds himself at the middle of everything.
So, part of it's accident and part of it's the kind of thing that happens with a guy like Pete Rose. These were some of the true glory years of baseball. And I want to be clear about that subtitle on my book. I'm not pining nostalgic for these days. I'm simply saying the crowds, the television audiences, the uh, the size of baseball in our consciousness at the time are all massive, and the game is still unpolished. It's this rough and tumble thing, and Pete Rose, in many cases, brings that rough and tumble mentality. You've got several iconic moments that unfold, and he's right in the middle of it. The collision at home plate to end the 1970 All-Star game, that collision between Pete Rose and Ray Fosse, a moment that defines both men. Multiple World Series with the Reds and the Phillies, those great Big Red Machine teams, his 44-game hit streak in 1978, which is, by the way, a hit streak we haven't seen the likes of since 1978. And then, of course, the chase for the all-time hit record, which, was so iconic at the time that I would submit that if you were alive that night in 1985 and you were watching, you remember exactly where you were. And it's not going to happen again. The current major league leader, active leader in hits to start this season was Freddie Freeman, a great player. Freddie Freeman has 2,115 hits to start this season. He's 34 years old. Even if Freddie Freeman were to average over the next decade the same amount of hits he's averaged over the last 3 years at the peak of his career, he would still come up short. He would not break the all-time hit record. It is simply not happening.
So, talk to us about the other side of his legacy. You've also said he's a cautionary tale because he had it all and was a beloved icon, and it was his choices that threw it away. So, let's talk about the fall in 1989.
One of the things I did in the narrative, aside from sketching out this rise and this fall, is to note and leave breadcrumbs along the way, because it's not, Pete Rose doesn't go down in 1989 for something he did on a whim 3 weeks or 3 months earlier, or something he did once. This is a lifetime of gambling, a lifetime of poor decisions that's going to come to a head around 1987, and then finally make it to the front office of Major League Baseball 2 years later. So, one thing that the book does is show how Pete got into gambling and why he got into gambling, and how he was initially doing it, gambling with bookies who were just other good time guys on the west side of Cincinnati, family friends, effectively, the neighborhood bookie, the kind of guy who would let someone like Pete Rose carry a debt and not come after him for it. But my reporting shows clearly that by 1975, even during the epic 1975 World Series between the Red Sox and the Reds, it's already a concern in the Reds dugout and clubhouse about Pete's relationships with gamblers. By 1978, based on my reporting, there is some kind of intervention that happens in Cincinnati. Before a game at Riverfront Stadium, there is some kind of meeting between Pete Rose and officials from Major League Baseball to discuss his gambling. And then it only grows worse into the 1980s. So there's an open secret. The open secret is ignored or buried, but it cannot be buried forever. And you're right, based on his own decisions, his own choices, and really his own addictions, Pete Rose is going to go down.
Well, that, you used the word addiction, and in this context with addiction to gambling, did you come away from this, the people that you talked to, especially the investigators and the people he played against, thinking that this was truly just an addiction, or was this a situation where Pete Rose enjoyed being around surly figures?
Great question. I did an interview once with a man named Jerry Carroll, prominent businessman in the Midwest, made a lot of money and made his name building and running racetracks. And Jerry Carroll loved Pete Rose, and they would often spend the night together at the track, Jerry's tracks. But Jerry told me that one of his big concerns about Pete, and I'm talking mid 1980s, I'm talking before the fall, is that Pete seemed to surround himself with guys who were willing to do whatever Pete wanted to do. And I don't know what that says about Pete Rose. And Jerry Carroll didn't know what it said either. You know, this was a man who could have hung out with anybody, Pete Rose. But he chooses to hang out with young admirers who are really caught in the spotlight of Pete Rose's fame, want to stay in that spotlight, are willing to do anything to do that. And Pete often used these men to place his bets with bookies and then to place his bets on baseball. And I do think that that is the behavior of an addict. You know, he was surrounding himself with people who were happy to aid and abet him in his addiction. And, you know, like many addicts, Pete Rose has struggled over the years to really speak honestly about what was happening at that time. He's contradicted himself at times about whether or not he was ever really addicted. But in my interviews with the people who were in that inner circle, who had a front row seat to Pete's gambling in the 1970s and 80s, every single one of them said that he was horribly addicted to gambling and there was nothing that they could do to stop it.
Pete thought he would still be able to get into the Hall of Fame, even accepting this punishment. And Bart Giamatti had said he looked forward to seeing how they judged life and art. And you kind of look at that in the book, sort of, are we looking at people's lives and the way they lived or the art that they created? Can you just talk about how things changed for Pete after he accepted the punishment?
This is a key point, and I think it's been forgotten by most baseball fans. I'll be honest, I had forgotten this part of the story before I got into it. In 1989, when Pete accepts his banishment, and it's important to point out that he does, he signs a document agreeing to it. He knows full well that his name is going to appear on the ballot at Cooperstown 2 years later in 1991, 5 years removed from his last at bat as a player. And I think there's a very good likelihood that Pete gets elected if that's the case. But in early 1991, 10 months before his name will appear on the ballot, the National Baseball Hall of Fame changes the rules. And they now state that only eligible players can be placed on the ballot. It's effectively the Pete Rose corollary because he is ineligible. And writers at the time, the voters, are angry. And not just because they wanted to vote for him. You know, some write entire columns complaining about the rule change because for the very first time, the Hall of Fame has basically pre-screened a player out of the pool of official voters of players, and you know, I understand why it happens. As one writer notes at the time, if Pete Rose is on the ballot, it could destroy the Hall of Fame because he was essentially at war with baseball over the key allegations in the final report. But Sparky Anderson, the Hall of Fame manager for the Reds, said something that winter, right when this rule change was imposed, that I think has turned out to be true. Sparky said it was a mistake. For no other reason, he said it was a mistake because now that we wouldn't be able to vote on it, this question about Pete Rose was going to loom over baseball forever. And no matter how you feel about Pete Rose, Sparky was right about that because 35 years later, it does still loom over baseball.
We know you have to go, but before you go, to me, the most interesting thing that I wanted an answer to from your book is, does Pete Rose see himself as a victim, or does he now accept responsibility and realize what he did?
I'm going to give an answer that sounds crazy and contradictory all at once. It's both. You know, Pete Rose, in his mind, has apologized and apologized again and again. And so he believes he has come clean. And yet he does all too often, you know, paint himself as a victim or quibble with pieces of the investigation in 1989. Even the title of his book, his memoir that he wrote in 2004, in which he, for the first time, admitted that he was lying all these years and he had bet on baseball, paints him as a victim. My Prison Without Bars is the title of that book. So both are true. And what I have hopefully tried to do in this book is paint a portrait of this man, who at one time was the center of not just the baseball universe, but the sporting universe in America, and in many ways still is. And again, whether you like baseball or not, whether you root for Pete Rose or not, I think at the end of the day, this is just a compelling story of a man.
We didn't even have time to get to Shohei, which makes this the perfect time for the book to come out. Maybe we'll get you back sometime. The book is Charlie Hustle. It's available everywhere now. As you go on your tour around the country, you can learn more at keithob.com. Keith, best of luck with the book, and thanks for the time to talk about it all.
Thanks for having me. It was a great conversation, guys.